Becky, are you ready?
Yeah, should I just go straight in?
I'll do a quick introduction.
All right.
I'll do a quick introduction.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we are ready to start. Welcome to LSE and to this event on mainstreaming nature positive economics for people and planet. Wonderful to have you with us today. My name is Simon Diekow. I'm a distinguished policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute for Climate Change and the Environment here at the LSE. And this event here today is organized by, jointly organized by the LSE Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. I'll provide a little bit of background for the event, and then we'll hand over to Becky for her keynote address. So a week from today, we will have the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP16 in Cali in Colombia. So we are all getting ready, our talking points, our thinking, our economic and policy arguments to prepare for the meetings. And we are doing this in the background of now 2 years after the last COP, where I would say we have some increasing acceptance that there is more to the environment than just climate and just CO2. And that more broadly, our economies are somehow embedded in nature and not just external and unrelated to nature and the environment. And nature is, of course, very complex, also philosophically very complex theme. I recognize that. But what we mean when we speak about nature, we mean that it's not just climate. It's not just CO2 emissions. It's essentially also what surrounds us. It's the forests, it's the land, it's the ocean, and importantly, the complex interaction between all of these different parts of nature and the environment. Between ecosystem services and biodiversity, between the economy and the financial system, and then between the economy and businesses and policy. And this is a little bit what we will discuss today. So a lot of complexity, recognizing that this is not easy, but also recognizing that we need to make it more complex now, that it's not enough to just focus on CO2 emissions, and that we need to be very well prepared for COP and for these discussions, where we bring broader nature into the policy frameworks of especially central bank supervisors and finance ministries. So with this, yes, what we will discuss today with the panel and also with the audience are essentially these broader questions around the role of policymakers in addressing nature loss and contributing to a nature positive economy for people and planet. And with this, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Becky Spade, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. The RSPB is the largest nature conservation organization in the UK. The charity forges powerful new partnerships that inspire others to stand up and give nature the home it deserves, both in the UK as well as internationally, and as part of BirdLife International, where it works to stem the loss of global biodiversity. Becky leads RSPB in a decade when critical action is crucial to combat extinction. And with this, Becky, very interested to hear from you. Welcome to LSE.
Thank you, Simon. So it's great to be here. And I'm very thankful to the LSE, Firoz, Lalji Institute for Africa for arranging this event, and to the Grantham Institute for participating in it. And it couldn't come at a better time with the UN Biodiversity COP in Cali, Colombia, only 1 week away. And close to home, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is due to give the government's first budget and spending review on the 30th of October. And I wanted to start this evening with two really simple truths, which I'm indebted to that seminal review on the economics of biodiversity by Sir Partha Dasgupta. First of all, it's widely recognized that nature is our most precious asset, and that our economies, livelihoods, and our well-being depend on nature for the food we eat, the clean we drink, and the fresh air that we all breathe. It's the critical asset that provides the foundation for our collective health, wealth, and well-being. But let's not forget that these are not the only reasons for protecting and restoring nature. We all value the natural beauty of nature, the pure joy we get from its existence, and we have a moral responsibility to safeguard it for its own sake. My second truth is that we have collectively failed to engage with nature in a sustainable way. The demands we place on nature far exceed its capacity to supply us with the goods and services that we rely on. Paraphrase for Professor Dieter Helm, if something is not sustainable, then that means it will not be sustained. So do I need to say more to reflect on the gravity of the situation that we all face? SCUPTA highlights this as a collective failure. Globally, this means the stock of natural capital per person has declined by nearly 40%, whilst produced capital per person doubled. And human capital per person increased by over 10%. Just last week, WWF's Living Planet report showed that there has been a 70% decline in wildlife populations globally over the past 50 years. That's just my lifetime. Humanity may have prospered in recent decades, but the ways in which we have achieved that prosperity have come at a devastating cost to nature, to the extent that we would require 1.6 Earths to maintain the world's current living standards. Nowhere is this more apparent than here in the UK, where we are already one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. If you're in any doubt of this, then please take time to read last year's State of Nature report. It shows that 16% of species are threatened with extinction, and that since 1970, the abundance of terrestrial and freshwater species has declined by a fifth. It's actually one of the most important economic reports we receive, yet it's not treated that way. Why do I say that? Well, new research this year, led by the Green Finance Institute, shows that nature-related risks are as detrimental to the economy as those posed by climate change, but have not been factored into financial decision-making. This is leaving the economy and the financial sector dangerously exposed. The analysis shows that damage to the natural environment is already slowing the UK economy and could lead to an estimated 12% reduction in the size of the economy in the years ahead. This will be larger than the hit to the economy from the global financial crisis or from COVID-19. Sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, and utilities suffer the most, with profound impacts on the financial sector. So let's be clear, nature crisis is an economic crisis, the consequence of our economic actions globally, and can only be averted by new economic solutions. It would have been nice to hear a bit more on this from the PM at today's investment summit, where rather than the outdated growth at all costs rhetoric, he could have supported natural capitalism, delivering economic stability and sustainability. These new solutions, which I want to cover in a bit more detail today, often come under the banner of nature-positive economics. It's worth first considering what we mean by a nature-positive economy. In simple terms, it's how we work together to allocate scarce resources of land, people, capital, and raw materials in a way that halts nature loss, leads to nature recovery and net zero future, and delivers improvements in economic well-being. Bottom line is that we must undertake conservation and restoration to increase the capacity of nature to supply the many services at a level that sustains us. We now have so much experience across the globe on how we can do this effectively. For example, the RSPB has been working to protect and conserve the Gola rainforest for over 30 years, in close collaboration with local partners, communities, and the governments of Sierra Leone and Liberia, while also developing local livelihood opportunities and sustainable financing. This flagship project is one which we are looking forward to showcasing alongside Sierra Leone and Liberia at COP16. But another example, closer to home, in fact 50 miles due east of here to be precise, is the Wallasey Island Wild Coast Project. This landmark conservation and engineering project used soil rail and remains one of the largest of its type in Europe, with over 650 hectares of new lagoons, mudflats, salt marsh, and grassland, providing much needed food and shelter for wildlife, as well as protecting inland communities from coastal flood risk. In December 2023, we saw the highest ever number of water birds at our reserve there, 38,000. We also need to see concerted action that will change the way our economy operates in order to reduce the demands we place on our natural environment. But simply, we need to diminish our ecological footprint. This requires new ways of thinking and a new holistic and inclusive way of measuring economic success. At the systemic level, we must reduce our insatiable demand for more goods and services so that it does not exceed Earth's capacity to supply them. At the local level, placemaking must be more sustainable and local communities involved in decision-making. Today, I want to expand on these new ways of thinking and break them down into three key areas: fiscal reform and public investment, business change and private sector investment, and monetary and financial reform. So let's start with fiscal reform. Addressing the nature crisis requires substantial investments to create and restore wildlife habitats, expand nature-friendly management practices in the wider countryside, address the needs of threatened species, and tackle the many pressures on nature from pollution, development, climate change, and invasive species. Finance will be a key focus at COP16, especially with regards to how to ensure that adequate finance is available and accessible across the world for delivery of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. A key mark of success for COP16 will be for parties to demonstrate how they will meet their commitment to mobilize at least $20 billion annually in international biodiversity finance from developed to developing countries by 2025. For the UK specifically, we need to demonstrate we can deliver more finance to meet both global and national commitments. The Green Finance Institute estimates that over the next 10 years, there's a nature finance gap of £5 to £6 billion per year in the UK. Our private finance has a key role to play in filling this gap. It cannot be left solely to the private sector. Public finance has a critical role to play, not least because it can lead the way and help leverage in private sector funding. But there's a strong rationale for government intervention to invest in nature because many of the services provided by nature are public goods. Investment in nature also delivers cost-effective solutions where benefits significantly outweigh the costs. In the UK, the benefit to cost ratio of closing the natural capital gap to meet the nature-related SDG means that for every pound invested, we could receive £34 in benefits. The total potential net benefit for the UK is estimated at close to £1 trillion over 10 years. The evidence base for nature-based solutions is also very strong. They provide a cost-effective means of addressing issues such as flood management, water purification, climate regulation, and coastal protection. In addition, they can provide better value for money than built infrastructure, as well as multiple benefits for people and nature. But despite this strong rationale and evidence base, nature has not received its fair share of public funding. Work by the Resolution Foundation has highlighted that we have a long-standing problem of underinvestment more generally in the UK economy. There's recognition of how previous fiscal rules have prevented essential investment in our infrastructure, and we would include our natural environment in that. Their view is that further reform to address short-termism and over-reliance on debt rules is critical for economic sustainability and security. The current fiscal situation in the UK is challenging, but let's be clear, it does not need to prevent critical investment in our natural infrastructure, bringing benefits for nature, people, and planet. We can choose to take action or choose to sit by and watch the economic risks just intensify. The new government's fiscal rules cannot be used as an excuse to say that we cannot afford critical investment in nature. Reforms they have instigated are a start, but do not go far enough and fail to learn from the problems created by our past over-reliance on restrictive debt rules. Further reform to the fiscal framework is essential. We are not to risk our economic sustainability, security, and stability. We at the RSPB are calling for 4 changes to implement it in the budget. A new green golden rule that would allow government to borrow to invest in net zero and nature positive. The reporting on wider measures of public sector assets and liabilities at fiscal events must include natural assets. In tandem, the new National Wealth Fund must also be able to take a holistic approach to national wealth and invest in natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions. Thirdly, all spending reviews must have a natural capital action plan with associated funding that sets out what is required to keep us on track to meet our international and domestic nature commitments. And finally, we need independent input and oversight of our natural capital planning by a new body, similar to the model of the UK Climate Change Committee, which will be a UK Nature Positive Committee that advises governments across the UK on what is needed to meet our nature commitments. Our desire for greater oversight, management and funding for natural capital was highlighted perfectly last week when Natural England published their State of Natural Capital report, which highlighted so well the decline in natural capital and the risks associated with that, but also the vacuum around responsibility for rectifying the situation. Taxation can also play an important role in nature's restoration. It's a powerful tool for governments to influence behaviour, promote economic growth and redistribute wealth. Environmental taxes have a key role to play in incentivising behaviours that reduce impacts on nature, particularly by taxing environmentally damaging practice or externalities. Currently, environmental taxation revenue for the UK accounts for only 2% of GDP, lagging behind many other OECD countries. Dasgupta highlighted the role that harmful taxes and subsidies play in the decline of biodiversity, and harmful subsidies are the focus of Target 18 under the Global Biodiversity Framework. World Bank has estimated environmentally harmful subsidies at more than $7 trillion annually, or more than 8% of global GDP. The UK is no different, although their scale and damage is less clear, and there needs to be a full assessment and a clear plan for reform. A good starting point, however, would be to get our current system of agricultural subsidies to provide greater support for nature-friendly farming. And I plea, do go to our website and sign our petition on exactly this issue. More generally, there needs to be greater consideration of how tax policy impacts on the environment and a greater emphasis on the longer-term impacts. A new approach to reporting and assessment of tax policy needs to be embedded in decision-making. We recommend that the government commissions an independent review on how the tax system can be better utilised to achieve nature and climate targets. Reform should be guided by a clear set of principles, including supporting our environmental principles and aligning with climate and biodiversity goals. Turning now to the second key element of a nature-positive economy and the critical role for business. We know many businesses see the commercial and economic imperative to act on nature, not least from those we already work with. They include Barratt's, the house builder, Cemex, the cement company, ID Verdi, who manage green space, the Royal and Ancient Golf Body, Openreach, the digital network provider, and Lightrock and Elements Green in the renewable sector. Significant changes are still required, and every business decision should be looked at with nature-tinted glasses, exploring how businesses impact nature across their operations, bringing their employees, supply chains, customers, and competitors with them to find innovative ways to reduce their impacts on the planet. We cannot expect business to deliver the necessary change in isolation. We have to recognise that we all have a role to play in generating nature-positive businesses. Businesses, after all, are a collection of people, shareholders, employees, and customers. And without people change, we do not get business change. That's why, together with the National Trust and WWF, we've launched Nature's Workforce, a new online guide to help employees take steps to make nature part of everyday decision-making, factory floor to the boardroom. We're calling on all businesses to set demanding and audacious targets for nature and climate, such as science-based targets for nature, and engage with voluntary initiatives like the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. It's amazing to see so many companies engaging with TNFD, but we need to go further and ensure that full disclosure by businesses of nature-related dependencies and impacts and the actions required to reduce them is a requirement, not an option. Business action alone is not going to be enough in the transition to a nature-positive economy. Government has to play a greater role, both to show leadership at home and internationally, and also to leverage in private sector investment. We cannot rely on goodwill and CSR to deliver the change we need. Government must set the right incentives and regulatory framework to deliver the pace of change required. WWF set out earlier this month the case for the development of government-endorsed nature sectoral pathways, which could be a welcome development in this area to ensure action scales to the level necessary at the sectoral and economy-wide level. Government's role includes, but is not limited to, ensuring that the emerging nature markets that we are seeing across the UK and internationally operate at scale and with high integrity. It's great to see the work by BSI on nature market standards, but that's only part of the jigsaw required. The extent to which these standards will be used and how nature markets will evolve is still very much up for grabs. Let's now consider the final critical area for nature reform, the finance system. At COP16, we want to see the UK continuing to lead the global conversation to mobilise finance for nature from all. Financial sector and central banks are at the heart of the financial flows, current unsustainable economic activities, and have a critical role to play in the transition to nature positive. Thankfully, I'm not alone in recognising this, and far be it for an environmental NGO to tell financiers how to run the financial system. There are far more experienced people who have the expertise and knowledge and know how to do that, and I hope Eleanor and Simon are not watching. But it was only just over 2 years ago today that here at the LSE, the Network for Greening the Financial System, central banks and financial supervisors, and Inspire, an independent research network co-hosted here at the LSE by the Grantham Research Institute, published their agenda for action on biodiversity loss, financial risk, and system stability. It stated that financial regulators and central banks can and must enable the greening of the financial system. This role is not inconsistent with their mandates for price and financial stability. It set out 5 recommendations that are applicable to all central banks and financial supervisors wherever they are in the world. I won't run through them all now, but they included developing a response strategy and building capacity and skills. I think it's the right time, over 2 years down the line, to have a report card on where the Bank of England is on these issues and a clear plan of action with demanding timelines. We need to move quickly from a situation where, to paraphrase John Maynard Keynes, we are getting things precisely wrong, to one where they are broadly right. Biodiversity is complex and difficult to measure, and the interaction with the economy and financial system is multifaceted. But these valid points are not justification for inaction. I hope that I've set out clearly the key components of a nature positive economy and how we can mainstream nature positive thinking across economic policy, whether that be through fiscal policy, business activity, or monetary and financial policy. But I want to finish on one final thought that I hope we can continue to discuss as a panel and with you. How can we, as RSPB and other NGOs, great academic institutions like the LSE, businesses, the financial sector, government, think tanks, trade unions, and civil society, collaborate more effectively and in new ways to deliver a nature positive economy together? If we do not, then we will fail in meeting all our environmental and economic objectives. And most importantly of all, we face letting the next generation down irreparably. I hope today can be a key point, sparking those new collaborations and really delivering change.
Thank you, Becky, for this excellent keynote address that really provides a very comprehensive overview of all the different parts of governments and policy and business that you need to work together in order to achieve this transition. And that's also exactly what we want to discuss now with the panel. First and foremost, I would like to welcome Dougie Peedle to the panel, Head of Nature Positive Economy at RSPB. He is also a member of the Armed Forces Pay Review Body and the Aberdeen Economic Policy Panel, and he has over 30 years of economics experience, including as chief economist of the Jersey government and the Scottish Wildlife Trust. And secondly, very importantly, Elena, who, as already mentioned, has led the NGFS Inspire study group, that explored the connection between biodiversity loss and financial stability here at LSE. Elena is also a senior policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute, where she's leading our broader nature and central banking and financial stability team. I will start with a quick round of first and second questions, and then would very much like to open up the floor to the audience. Important to say, we will also have a reception where you can talk to all of us and ask other questions that you may have. But first, Becky, quick follow-up question, well, big follow-up question. How can the UK and other countries show real nature positive leadership in the global economy? And I'm specifically interested in this context in some examples of nature positive leadership from around the world.
Yeah, so I saw that question. I thought it was very good. I mean, when I asked colleagues about, who's doing this and who's doing it well, the example that came back, because I think it's a very kind of current example, is that Canada has put in a good MBSAP, which is this plan that everybody has to put in for the biodiversity COP, to say how they're going to deliver those coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework goals. And Canada has put in a good plan, and in particular, it addresses target, I think it's target 14, but I could get that wrong. Dougie's nodding, good. but it's basically a really kind of thorough, proper plan. And it has to be said that a lot of MBSAPs have not come forward. So there is this kind of lag in MBSAPs coming forward. And certainly when I challenged our Secretary of State on it, to be fair, he'd only just got into the job. He was a bit sort of like, oh, what's an MBSAP? So it's kind of, it's really, really important that we see that coming forward from countries. And to be fair, actually now the UK has said it's committed to those targets and is going to provide more detail. I think, so getting your MBSAP in, it's a really kind of good sign of global leadership in this area. And I think also the finance piece. So, proper delivery plans, proper finance that backs it up. And in the UK, we'd want to see really good collaboration between the different countries of the UK as well. So, they all have kind of responsibility, and we would like to see that a really good collaborated plan. And tying into other great global commitments. So we've got the climate change commitments as well. So you'd want to see reading across between the two. And that's something that we've certainly been pushing for really hard at the RSPB. And I think BirdLife International and others have been pushing as well. So finance is really important. Senior government leadership. So who's going to go to COP16 for the UK? So the Secretary of State is signed up, I think, which is great at DEFRA. But are we going to see somebody senior from the Treasury? Are we going to see the PM? Are we going to see someone from the FCDO? It's kind of that senior level of leadership that you want to see as well. And then kind of, the final thing I would love to see the UK doing is offering to kind of host COP17. That would be a real commitment to taking kind of global leadership in this area, which is the stated aim. So, who's doing it really well? Well, let's see, some MBSAPs look good. And Canada's looks good in particular is what my team is saying.
Okay, thank you, Becky. Yeah, no, very, very helpful. Elena, turning to you next. I'm interested in what Becky already mentioned in her keynote address, specifically what you see as the role for monetary and financial and prudential policy in addressing nature loss, in managing nature-related risks. Very interested in your framing, very interested in what you think these institutions should do.
Yeah, so I guess when you're talking about monetary and financial stability policies, we are talking mainly about what central banks and financial supervisors can do. And that's the context of my remarks now. So we know that central banks and financial supervisors are already working on climate-related risks. And this is mainly, as what Simon said earlier, the focus on carbon emissions, whilst broadly ignoring environmental-related risks. So I kind of want to first talk about the mandates of central banks and how they justify, working on climate-related risks, but yet not understanding that nature loss is also equally as important. So in terms of central bank mandates, we know that central banks are responsible for maintaining price stability and financial stability, but they also tend to have broader mandates like supporting government goals. And for many emerging market central banks, they tend to have even broader mandates like supporting financial inclusion and thinking about how jobs and livelihoods are impacted by a lot of different things, and that could include nature loss or jobs related to the commodity sector that can impact the economy. And with regards to this, not only do central banks in emerging markets have these mandates, even the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England have mandates, have secondary mandates to support government economic policy. So within this context, there is a rationale for if the government is working on climate change, which as a result of the Paris Agreement, most governments do, it's legally binding, central banks have the mandate to care about climate-related risks. And in this regard, this is the same rationale that they can also work on nature-related risk, particularly given the interconnectedness of climate and nature. So for example, climate change drives nature loss. The higher, like for example, higher temperatures lead to forest fires. It can lead to destruction of other ecosystem services. It can lead to the loss of species that are important for the functioning of our economy, or even just for its own sake. We should care about nature for its own sake. That nature loss can also drive climate change. So the loss of forests through things like deforestation or climate change can lead to further climate impacts, including increased emissions from forest loss. It could lead to climate impacts like flooding that central banks already care about. And thirdly, climate change mitigation can also lead to nature loss impacts. For example, if you are building a kind of a big solar farm, and you use a forested land to do that, you clear the forest and you build the solar farm, which is very common in many emerging market countries. And this is, you're trying to mitigate against climate change, but you are ruining nature as a result. And so all of these different things have to be taken into consideration. And thirdly, nature-based solutions can also be a way to mitigate against climate change. So there are all of these different ways that climate and nature interact, and it's important to keep that in mind when thinking about what central banks can do. So what can they do? We obviously spend a lot of time thinking about this and doing work on this. And in terms of the first step that they can take is do the research and signal that it's something that they care about. And central banks have already begun doing this. This could be, the first step of doing this is to maybe understanding the financial sector's dependency and impact on nature loss or nature's services. So it could be understanding, how is the agriculture sector dependent on this water or pollinators, and creating a whole understanding of that across the entire financial system, and understanding what is your exposure to nature-related risks. I guess that is kind of the most basic first step, and that's something that we had advised, or we had recommended central banks do 2 years ago when we did our report with the NGFS. And since then, many central banks have already begun to do this, but not quite enough. And once this assessment is done, it's not that you stop there. I think you need to care about your prudential policy. So that means paying attention to the sectoral and location risks of financial institutions and where their loans are based, and what ecosystems they're dependent on, where the economic activity is taking place. Are you maybe having you're maybe not clearing forests in your own, for example, in Europe and the UK, you're probably not clearing forests in your own backyard, but through your supply chains, you may be affecting forested lands elsewhere, or taking advantage of other ecosystems outside of your borders. And this is something that's not well understood. So understanding those micro level risks in your loan book is important, but also understanding your macro related risks, so your macroprudential policy. That's something that can already be done through nature scenario analysis, mainly to understand the risks to the financial system as a whole. And finally, for monetary policy, I think central banks can show leadership by putting more thought about what they put on their own balance sheets, and can also encourage financial flows into nature positive investments, for example. And I think that's might be the most important point, because central banks don't exist in their own vacuum. they also can encourage other players within government, within finance ministries to care more about nature and the environment. So I think this is a huge signal if central banks start doing things like this.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. And maybe to continue in this this train of thought. So we have government leadership where we need heads of governments, we need senior ministers to be excited, we need them to go to COP, we need them to signal that this is important. We need central banks to do the same if they technically understand it, if they have done the research, they need to let the financial sector know that this is important. And Dagi, now turning to you, very interested in your thoughts on then the role of broader economic and fiscal policy and how we change the way governments set their economic policy to move away from a very short-term focus towards more long-term thinking and a more long-term integration of nature.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a number of issues. The first one is just simply around timescales. There's a famous nature writer in Scotland that writes about golden eagles, and if you want to go and see golden eagles, he says you need to look at the middle distance, not focus down here or too high up in the air. Look at the middle distance, and I think that's true with economic policy. A very simple analogy: all the timescales are very, very short-termist. Yes, we have an OBR producing reports on long-term risks. That's great, but actually it's a separate report over here. Does it actually influence a budget? Has it influenced decision making in a budget? I'd argue not. Likewise, on monetary policy and central banking, again, you've got the ability, and they do the longer term analysis, but it does come down to price stability over the next 2 years and pulling levers to actually achieve that target. So I think getting the timescales right is absolutely critical. We've got to start asking the questions, not just what does this mean today for us here and now? What does this mean for longer term? And what are the real costs and benefits of decision making? Then I think it's probably around objectives. Elena's mentioned actually that the central banks can look at what other aspects of economic policy as well. But where's that economic policy set? Where is it actually laid out? Where's the clear objectives coming really from government around economic policy? And I think, again, we've got to see nature positive economics much more clearly in those economic objectives, because let's be clear, those simple truths that Becky outlined at the start, get those wrong, don't have a sustainable economy in the long term. So it really, really does matter. So getting those objectives right is really, really clear. I think the third area is really around using some of the tools and mechanisms that we've already got. So the Treasury has a green book, which it uses for policy evaluation, very detailed. There's a whole chapter in there called Enabling Natural Capital Thinking, okay? And it's there. There's a lot of analysis that can be done from that chapter, but actually, how widely is it used? I've yet to see any meaningful analysis coming out from that type of policy evaluation saying they've looked at those long-term implications for natural capital. So I think really getting that thinking there, getting it there is really, really important, using what's there. The other area as well is around tax information impact notes that are done for taxation changes. Exchequer departments are supposed to do these when we make taxation changes. Within that, you're supposed to be able to look at the environmental impacts. Not me, not our SPB saying this. The National Audit Office has looked at those and said, actually, they're not doing their job. They're not delivering for the impacts on the environment, for example. It's not being properly considered. So I think you can really get change both at the high level in terms of timescales, objectives, but also using the tools and mechanisms that we've got. You've got to get buy-in. And then finally, Becky referred to it, I do think we need institutional change alongside that. We need a new body. You've seen in monetary policy how independence can actually improve performance. We can have a whole separate discussion around independence of the central bank and the impacts that has, but I think it's generally perceived that move to independence has improved the situation and the outcomes on inflation at least. So I think actually really looking in that area and seeing how we can do more, how we can get change equivalent to that. So what could it be? Well, Becky's referred to it, a UK Nature Positive Committee that can actually advise governments across the UK, because of course this is a matter that's devolved, and say, this is what you need to do. This is what we need at the country level, the aggregate action that we need to build up to deliver the change that's needed. So I think that final area, institutional reform, has got to be delivered, and without it, we will struggle.
Thank you, Dagi. Becky, I would like to turn it back to you. So we've now spoken about the high-level government leadership, role of financial policy, the role of broader economic policy. What is missing so far are the businesses. So I'm very interested in your thoughts on what the role of businesses can be and how we can encourage them to be more nature positive.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting. So I think a lot of businesses that I talk to now really have got climate, kind of on their radar, and increasingly nature as well, actually, but kind of don't quite know how to address the second one, whereas with climate, there are some quite established ways of businesses starting to think about it and work with it. I name checked a number of businesses that we work with, and there will be the same for, other nature NGOs. And certainly in terms of the ones we work with, there are now, I think, 10,000 more hectares of land being well managed for nature as a result of those relationships. There's a great stat around, do you know about Swift bricks? So these are the bricks that you want to put into new developments so that Swifts still have somewhere to build a nest, because we've kind of filled in all of our holes in all buildings, and it's a disaster for Swifts. So, we know by working with people like Barrett's and getting the right standards in, we've now got 6,000 Swift bricks going into new development. So, these things can change. And I think that kind of nature's workforce policy I talked about, we've now got 390,000 employees kind of signed up to that. So that I always call them like the sleeper movement inside their businesses. They're kind of there to kind of rise up and make sure that nature is considered in decision making. And the TNFD disclosures, there are now, I think, 400 businesses signed up to doing that on a voluntary basis, of course. So there's some progress, but I think the big thing is, how do we move to a mandatory disclosure? That's the thing that will really, really drive change for business, I think. And I think that we always frame it as kind of businesses needing to think about 5 things, really. One is their physical footprint. So what are they actually doing to nature through their physical footprint? And that's often, there are some quite simple things that businesses can do to really improve that situation. Think obviously about the impact of their financial flows on nature, and really kind of get those kind of clarified and tackled. To think about how they can influence policy. So certainly, I think probably the business we do that mostly with is Barrett's, I would say. So Barrett's have been a good partner for us. We don't agree on everything, but often we've got something that we can kind of push together to try and kind of influence kind of nature-related policy. Of course, supply chain, you mentioned supply chain. Supply chain is fundamental. And if we can get businesses to really think about nature through their supply chain, that makes a difference. And then finally, the people one. So I think if businesses can tackle those 5 pillars, they can really kind of make progress. But I think at the end of the day, the thing that will really change it is making something like, TNFD mandatory. That's the thing that will really change it. And I don't think that's far away. I mean, I don't know if you saw the news report today about this sudden realization that nature is no longer absorbing carbon at the rate that we thought it was. And that's kind of throwing out all the climate calculations. I mean, at the risk of kind of painting an Armageddon-like picture, but it's throwing out all of the climate calculations that people have done around how much carbon would be absorbed by nature. And so I just think we're going to have to tackle this, and if it's not driven just by the kind of the nature strand, then it will be driven by the climate strand. So I think it's not that far away personally, but then I'm a Pollyanna.
Thank you, Becky. I would definitely have more questions for the panel, but I thought maybe this is a good moment to open it up to the audience and to see if there are questions. If you could please state your name. Yes, right here in the, oh yeah, the microphone's coming. Right here in the middle.
If it's a really difficult economic question, don't ask me. Ask these guys.
It's not. Well, thank you so much. My name is Chidera Mogalu, and I'm studying environment and development here. So both you, Becky, and Elena, you both touched on kind of how the financial sector can have an impact. And I don't know if this is like too broad of a question, but would you mind expanding a little bit on what that looks like? Because I can kind of envision what that looks like on a physical footprint level and on a supply chain management level, but do you mind expanding a little bit more on the financial in terms of the flow, like what that kind of looks like practically? Thank you.
Yes, I guess I can take that one pretty easily. So I think one of the ways that I would imagine it is to imagine a company. It could be a food and beverage company, and say you need resources from nature in order to produce your final product. And that could be the water from the groundwater services. And in economics term, we call these ecosystem services. So that's kind of like the benefits that you derive from nature. It's not the best term for ecologists, but this is how economists think about it. And so as a company that's producing this good, you are extracting a resource from nature. If that resource is depleted, for example, because of climate change or because of a significant degradation of that natural resource, you are creating a financial risk for your company. And because you are not then able to produce, this is in a very simple way, like you're just one company, that you don't have a parent, and you're one company, you cannot produce anymore. You may be financed by a loan from a bank. And if you are not able to repay that loan, that will impact the financial sector, the bank that you're lending to. And for us, that could have implications for the central bank to conduct their work. So this is one way to understand the financial risks from a loss of ecosystem service. But in terms of, on the other hand, when you are a bank and you are lending to a lot of different firms that may be facing similar constraints. If you have a large exposure to, say, the agricultural sector, and you are a bank that's based in Europe or the UK, but you have a huge footprint in, say, the supporting agricultural businesses in Latin America that's contributing to rainforest destruction. And this is the case for many globally systemic important banks. There was a recent report that was, I think, published just this week by some colleagues that we know from the UCL that showcased that a lot of finance is based in advanced economies that are flowing into destructive economic activities that may lead to destruction of all of these natural resources that are very important. So this is how the financial flows can interact with nature and cause greater risks of physical impacts, and that can go beyond borders as well.
Thank you so much.
Becky, I'm happy for you to also quickly respond.
Yeah, I think for me, it'd be great if we got to a position when, you know, if you're a business or an individual going to a bank actually looking to borrow money, it'd be great if they could actually look at all sorts of risks when they're lending money, but actually take into account that nature-related risk. And it'd be great actually if products varied in prices. You know, if I want to go and take out a loan to concrete over my front garden, I'd like that to maybe factor in that I'm going to impact on flooding in the local area, not going to absorb the removing carbon removal as well. So could we get to a point where the banking sector is actually saying, okay, we're going to price that differently than if you're actually going to do a green roof, or you're going to do something positive. And likewise with businesses, you know, this isn't, you know, radical change for a financial sector that prices all sorts of different risks. It needs to be in there in the mix. And actually just by making subtle changes, we can start to change those flows across the financial system and direct them in the right way. And I don't think we're a million miles away from doing that. We just need to get a bit more impetus behind it.
Yes.
Sorry, this is a really quick question, but do any of you know if the IMF considers biodiversity or nature or the environment a macro-critical factor? Because it sounds like they should. And do you know if there's any sort of discussions around that other than this one that we're having now?
Great question. I think maybe we collect one or two more and of a group of questions. Right? Yeah. Well, I thought first here quickly, and then we move over.
Thanks all, it's really interesting. The World Economic Forum has for a couple of years now highlighted climate change and collapse of ecosystem services as one of its biggest risks for the global economy. And you've all highlighted very nuanced and very comprehensive solutions. I was wondering whether you could maybe highlight the most, or the barriers, the most challenging barriers, the most interesting barriers that you see for why, with the evidence that Becky's outlined, the evidence that's clearly out there, the solutions that are clearly out there, what is stopping us from getting to this vision that you've outlined, which does seem to promise the solutions to all of these problems?
And
Hi, Brendan Costello from the Sword Association. So a couple of people have mentioned some of the risks around taking too narrow a focus on climate. People have also talked about the potential benefits of corporate disclosure frameworks. So wondering if the panel have any reflections on whether or not we should have single reporting frameworks, so you're not reporting in silos, either for climate, nature, or any other environmental impact.
one more. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Rachel Freeman. The UK Nature Positive Committee that you're proposing, I'm just interested in what type of people do you imagine being on that committee, and how do you see it being any different than all the committees that already exist? Is it an overarching sort of umbrella? I'd be very interested in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Becky, do you want to pick any of?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll kind of, what's stopping us, you know, which is the kind of $1 million question, really, isn't it? Oh. What's stopping us? I think there are a number of things. The first is that I think it's the short-termism issue. So I think that is kind of endemic in the way in which we kind of frame the threats we face and what we need to do about them. And I think that's a real problem when it comes to nature. I think nature has lost out to climate. So I think because even though climate is complicated, it is more easily codified in terms of how we measure it and we monitor it. And nature, almost by definition, is more complicated than that. And so I think there is a real struggle around finding the right metrics and the right way of measuring it. And I think that has been an issue. And I think I think there's a kind of a fundamental thing, which is that we take it for granted. You know, it has always been there. It has always provided us with these services, for want of a better term. And we do just take it for granted. So I think there's sort of a philosophical point around our relationship with nature. And we don't see ourselves as part of it. We see ourselves as somehow separate from it. And I think that's pretty fundamental in a lot of Western cultures in anyway. So it will be interesting to see as we work much more, I think, with indigenous cultures, which is what we're going to have to do if we really want to kind of protect and save nature, whether that will start informing some of our thinking about it. But that's quite a philosophical point, I suppose. Just on, and somebody else will say something sensible about it in a minute, but just in terms of the kind of UK kind of Nature Positive Committee, your question over here. Yeah, I'm kind of with you in that, you know, God, another committee. Dougie says it's a good idea, so you know, and I trust him. But I mean, you know, it's like, oh, come on. But I mean, the Climate Change Committee has been successful in terms of kind of having that sort of independence from government and really being able to kind of hold feet to fires in terms of kind of, are we, it's probably not the right kind of comparison to use, but are we making enough progress around climate, and are we making enough progress in terms of the different aspects that we need to make progress on? So I think that could be useful, in that it would give some kind of some weight to a system by which we could hold government to account successfully. Who would be on it? Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think there are enough kind of successful thinkers around nature now to be on that. I think the danger would be, I think the Climate Change Committee has been successful, I would say, because it's combined business, academics, politicians, in terms of kind of, you know, House of Lords, etc. So I think that sort of combination is quite successful, actually. So I think you could find I mean, I can't give you names, but I think you could find the people to be on it. Yeah. So yes, I suppose I'm talking myself into it. I think it would be a good idea, much as I hate committees. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Dougie, very interested. Who would you put on this?
Yeah, Dougie's going to
commission,
defend it.
please?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it'd be great if somebody actually was getting down to the detail and saying, right, how do we design this thing? But I would draw on kind of 3 areas, and it reflects a little bit the way our SPB works. Okay, so we do have economists at our SPB working together. You know, we do have scientists, and we do have ecologists and practical conservation all working closely together. And I think you need all 3 of those elements together to actually deliver. And I think it'd be that kind of credibility, that kind of mixture of experience, it's not getting together at the moment, and it's not advising governments and holding governments to account. And I think that's the only way to do it, get that level of expertise together, the real experts, and say, right, what do we need to do? What does it need to actually consist of? Government and private sector, are you getting together to actually deliver what? I think it's those 3 key skill sets.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of. It has to be said that, you know, Chris Stark is now leading that mission in government. You know, having been the sort of the outsider and leading the CCC, you know, he's now moved to that kind of very much a delivery role in government. You know, it remains to be seen whether he makes a success of that. I'm sure he will, knowing Chris, but you know, so I think that is the power that you build this kind of confidence and belief system in government that you can then go and deliver. So I think that would be one of the kind of advantages of it, looking at that experience.
And Elena, very interested in your thoughts on, yeah, who is recognizing this as a macro risk? Is it the IMF? Do you see specific central banks in specific countries that are recognizing that this is very real, or is it just happening on the surface within these very positive NGFS discussions where everyone's kind of excited about these topics?
Yeah, let me address the IMF point first, because we're working with a few really talented individuals within the IMF who really cared and was pushing for nature to be on many agendas. They were in our NGFS Inspire study group and contributed a lot to our discussions and framing our understanding of nature-related risks at the beginning. And they continue to do work. I think they have now a team of 3 or 4, maybe a growing team of 3 or 4 that are working on these topics. So it's not all lost. But with regards to the question that you asked, Simon, with who is currently working on these bigger issues and really doing the implementation work on economic risks with regard to nature, understanding financial risks with regards to nature, you know, we hear a lot about countries in Europe that care and are taking small steps on the research front. The ECB is doing a lot of good work and building capacity, but this is really on just the research side. There is yet to be very specific policies that come out of European central banks with regards to nature. But where we really see the difference being made, the policies being implemented, it's really in those countries where nature is really part of life and part of livelihoods. So, for example, in the Philippines, they did not wait for the NGFS or any other major central bank to tell them what the nature scenarios was. They conducted their own scenario analysis to understand, okay, if the forest in this region were to deplete, what would be the impact on our credit risk? They created a few different scenarios and just conducted the analysis. They didn't wait for anyone. They didn't announce it in a big announcement. They just got on with it and did that. And they are continuing to do the work and expanding this to understanding the blue economy, the ocean, which is a very missing part of discussion on nature within European central banks. Secondly, Brazil is doing a really good job as well. They started understanding environmental risks even before the Western world was looking at climate-related risks. So they are now including climate into their discussion, which is way more holistic than just working on climate and then deciding, oh, nature is way more complex because of the metrics that Becky had already spoken of. It's not just CO2, it's all of these other issues, number of species, the water quality, soil quality, so many different things. But Brazil had already been looking at this from the perspective of environmental risk, and now extending their understanding to climate. And they have had their rural credit policy framework that assesses what type of financing can agricultural firms get. And Malaysia, the Malaysian Central Bank, for example, worked on a climate disclosure, which includes environmental and biodiversity as part of their taxonomy. So I think these are really good examples of what you can actually do without waiting for anyone to tell you what to do, without waiting for, you know, a global framework, IMF to tell you what to do. Yeah, so these are examples that I'm encouraged by and feel optimistic about.
There was one more question on the silos and whether we are getting too close. I'm happy to just say a few words on this. I guess also connected to the macro question. This is the problem that also the very applied policy problem I think that we face when talking to policymakers, that yes, a lot are convinced that we need to do something about climate change, and then you come with nature and you try to make it more complex. And the first reaction that we usually get is this really necessary? Do we now need to also look into nature, and how is biodiversity connected to all of this? This is a struggle to bring this together. But the right approach would, of course, be to find a holistic approach that is complex, that models and brings in the climate-nature interaction, and that builds on where institutions have been active already on climate change, and makes it clear that this is not a separate thing that is somehow unrelated to everything else, but it somehow integrates this and brings a connection. And this is then also how you hopefully prevent working silos.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
So just as an addition, the International Sustainability Standards Board, so they kind of govern the way that financial institutions report on their risks. They are now considering or doing research on understanding how nature-related disclosures can be integrated into things like the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and trying to develop a more cohesive way for financial institutions to report this. So stay tuned.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's a really good point. I think ideally you wouldn't need silos and you wouldn't need a kind of compartmental approach. I think given where we're at, you maybe need to start from that position. And then, of course, all these things should be integrated and actually should be part of decision making. I think given where we're at, we do need that kind of nature lens and say, okay, how do we get the action that's needed for nature? How do we get the money flowing towards nature? And I think in time, it will be integrated and it will be cool. It's a really good point around silos, and just to make sure we don't create silos.
Shall we take two more quick questions? Yeah, maybe over here and one over here.
I work on green infrastructure and green things day and night, and I have a lot of conversations with commercial banks about nature. And it's really interesting to hear kind of how to mainstream it, because I think a lot of the feedback from commercial banks has been, we don't really know how to quantify it. We don't really know how to lend against it. There's no collateral, so it's kind of a lost in space. We want to do it. We know it's important. There's TNFD. So I'm curious to hear how you, potentially Elena, but all of you, how you see that interlink between what's happening, what signals central banks send to commercial banks, and kind of how that link goes through. And then also perhaps from the businesses that are investing, for example, Barrett's, are they using finance? Are they claiming sustainable finance by doing these initiatives? And kind of how are you seeing it from the commercial bank side? Because obviously, as you mentioned, the private sector is very, very important in moving nature forward. So yeah, keen to hear your thoughts.
Hi, yes. Sorry. Yeah. So actually two questions, but it's just one question. First question is, you mentioned about this idea of creating this task force. But I wonder, how does that differ from the experience of the Natural Capital Committee of the UK in 2013? because I know the RSBP was involved in pilots, corporate natural accounting projects, and I don't know how was your experience related to that. And in terms of what you said about potential members, I think on that committee there was economists, scientists, and professionals. So, I mean, nothing new in a way, but that kind of failed. So yeah, and the other point was something you said about the TNFD, and you said that it would be great if it was mandated. But then how do you avoid businesses going into executing a compliance exercise versus something that could actually translate into nature positive actions? And on that point, maybe you can elaborate maybe a bit more on the role that supply chains play in terms of corporate disclosure, because that seems to be a pretty big issue in terms of what businesses they can actually do, especially financial institutions, because a lot of times their emissions or their impact come from their supply chains versus their entity impacts. Thank you.
Keith, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can't remember what the first question was. Remind me.
On the commercial banks, but I can
Oh, yeah.
handle that.
The only thing I had to say on that was, what's interesting is we've got some banks talking to us at the moment. And I think the thing that is making them come and talk to us is this issue about exposure. So who they are lending to and the risk they can see around that on their kind of risk profile. So that's just, I mean, I just share that, kind of, it's just interesting that is the driver, I think. But Eleanor will be able to say kind of, more intelligent things than that. In terms of the Natural Capital Committee, that's a good question. I mean, I wasn't at the RSPB when kind of that was all happening. I was at the Woodland Trust, and I can remember going to various conversations around the Natural Capital Committee. It was kind of good. It was quite very technical, and so I don't think, just as a sort of a slightly external observer, it didn't really get the cut through because it was so technical. And so it didn't have, I think the Climate Change Committee has been very good around how it communicates what it's doing and what it's saying to government much more widely than government. And I think that has been part of its success. It has built a kind of momentum of pressure around, and that very clear sort of marking the homework thing they do. I don't think the Natural Capital Committee ever did any of that. So that's the stuff that I think has made it have real traction. And that's what I think we would probably want to see echoed. But you might, again, have more to say on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the obvious thing is the Natural Capital Committee is no longer here with us. So, and if you go back and think about its remit, it wasn't quite what we were saying. So it did do a lot of good work and a lot of important reports. But again, they kind of sat over here and didn't have any influence. So I think what we're trying to do is bring back, yes, a similar idea. It wasn't coincidence that we were quoting the chairman of the Natural Capital Committee in Becky's speech. But, bring that back in a way that it's got a much stronger remit, almost, Capital Committee on steroids, and give it some influence and real ability to hold people to account. So, yeah, it was a good start, but then it just withered on the vine, and that's what you can't allow to happen.
Banks?
Yeah, so with regards to the banks, they face, when it comes to both nature and climate, they face physical and transition risks. So physical is like the impacts from nature loss, and transition risk is the impacts from, say, either regulations that come into place or maybe litigation risks, like say you are suing a company because they're not protecting nature. And with regards to commercial banks and the signals they get from central banks, I think there has been a growing momentum since, I think, COP15, where a lot of banks and other corporates have been trying to understand how to report on nature because they were afraid of the regulations that were coming. Now, I think we're at a point in which the regulations are a bit too slow, and they want to ramp down their, like, all of the capabilities that they've built. It's very complex. Like, we don't know how to, it's very difficult to measure the different parts of nature. And a lot of banks and non-banking corporates have begun to do this. But they did this as a result of being fearful of upcoming regulation. If the regulation doesn't materialize, we are not going to be in a good place, because this is where there's a tension. And that's why our work is a lot about pushing regulation forward. So I think that's kind of where we're standing right now. And then I just wanted to go back on the supply chains point. I think the fact that it is hard doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. You can understand where you are lending to with regards to location. And a lot of different financial institutions also have forest risk commodities where they know they lend to this. And so they try to minimize lending towards those countries or those specific sectors in order to manage their risk portfolio as a whole. So I think that is something that can already be done. It doesn't mean that you understand every part of your supply chain, but you can understand what type of activity it goes to. And you can already report on that. I don't think TNFD makes it, you have to report on it, but you kind of can report on it. And I think it would be great if it's more, well, first, we have less voluntary disclosures and we have more mandatory disclosures, but then we also are, in those disclosures, we have to disclose on location risk.
Just coming back on supply chain, I think the other important thing is it is hard when you get into supply chain. It's a bit like the equivalent of scope 3 on emissions. And I think there's just a risk that it can become too complicated. So Becky was referring to, we've got 5 pillars that businesses should be looking at. And absolutely, you can start on a part of the supply chain, but it does get hard. And what we don't want to do is that to put people off and just go, oh, it's too hard, we can't possibly go that far down our supply chain. So that's when you've got to look at things more broadly as well. If you can start on something like working with your employees, using the tool that we've published, and actually use that as a starting point, then start maybe with a little bit of the supply chain going certain direction, that, you know, that the people that you work with most closely and starting having that impact. I think that's really important. But absolutely, the end game has got to be that it's got to get to supply chain, but don't want it to put people off and become too scary.
Thank you. I think there were quite a few more questions, and I would like to hear all of them, but I would propose that we do this over drinks. We have a drinks reception on the 5th floor in the staff dining room. All of you are invited. We will be there. Please come, speak to us, speak to the panelists. And yes, please join me in thanking the panelists for this great discussion.